Welcome back to a new episode of Podcast on the Brink. It's Wednesday morning, April 19th. Transfer portal recruiting season still in full swing for Indiana basketball as the Hoosiers have 10 scholarships filled. If you count Xavier Johnson for next season, still 3 spots open. So a lot still to be decided for next year's roster. We're gonna look back a little bit on this week's episode of Podcast on the Brink. We're also going to look forward. Ryan Corazza of Inside the Hall. He's back from paternity leave, and he's back on Podcast on the Brink. Ryan, how you doing this morning?
I'm good. Ready to fire off those Indiana basketball takes.
So I wanted to start, we talked a little bit yesterday, and I sent you some topics of things I wanted to cover on this week's episode. You watch this team, this program as closely as anybody with the minute after and all the film work that you do. I wanted to ask you just big picture, what were the main things that you saw that were different maybe from year one of Mike Woodson to year two?
Well, I think in terms of game management, there were definitely some noticeable differences, right? In his first season, there were those hockey lineups he was kind of throwing out where around the 12-minute timeout, kind of putting in another four. I feel like it was like 4 or even 5 players, right? And they were those big line changes, which did not go very well. And I think is a little bit, a lot actually from just his time in the NBA. I think that's a little bit more of a standard practice there in some sense in terms of rotations and lineups. I do think by the end of last season that kind of went away, but that was something that we did not see like at all this year. Never kind of like flirted with once. I also think in terms of game management and on court stuff, use of timeouts and sort of situational stuff, and kind of having his thumb on the scale a little bit more than his first season. I think the Illinois game at Illinois is one that stands out in terms of they got off to a rough start. Went down, I don't know what it was, 6-0 or something like that, 8-0. And he called the timeout, kind of settled things down. Very early timeout in the game. And they went on to win that game, like going away, right? So I think some of that kind of stuff, just kind of knowing the college game a little bit better. And in terms of just playing time, kind of going back to that first point, when you think about going from kind of trying to have a deep bench at the start of his first season to like riding his best players 40 minutes, like every game in and game out, pretty much halfway through the Big Ten season on, I feel like, or even like earlier than that with TJD kind of his back kind of kept him from doing that a little bit earlier on in the season. But so, yeah, I think in terms of game management, that's the kind of stuff that stands out. And I think having one more year of kind of watching it all, I think you can start to see the culture that's being built. I think Mike Woodson has done a good job of connecting with the players, of keeping everybody bought in, of, being sort of that old school, tough disciplinarian at times, but still being a player's coach. And I think it's a good balance. And you kind of look at, there hasn't been any sort of mass exodus, or I think the players that have entered the portal, maybe other than Armand Franklin, have been players that just haven't quite panned out or haven't really gotten the playing time or evolved. And so those are kind of some of the things that I think stand out between his first and second season.
Yeah, I think you make a really good point there with just kind of the player retention part of it, because there's been like a long stretch of time now for Indiana basketball, really dating back to Bob Knight, where it hasn't really felt like the leader of the program, however you want to characterize a coach. I mean, they're at this point in the game, you're basically the CEO of a program, and the buck stops with the guy at the top. And there's just been a long period of time where it never has felt like the coach at Indiana has kind of had, I don't want to say control, but like command of the program. We saw with Tom Crean, there was a long period of time where he put some really good teams on the court, but it was always kind of a roller coaster just in terms of the results on a year-to-year basis. Some of the things that went on off the court with players getting into trouble and things like that. And then with Archie Miller, obviously never really kind of established himself as someone that you looked at and said, well, he's in command of this program. Indiana's going in the right direction. I think one of the best compliments you can give Mike Woodson for what he's been able to do since coming to Indiana was just bring stability. Have the results been as strong as some would have helped, particularly this last season? Obviously, there was expectations for deeper than a round of 32 run, but in terms of just being that steadying presence and figure who feels like, he's got the respect of most of the fan base. The players seem to be bought in and really respect him as a coach. And there's not too many people you can find that are critical of Mike Woodson in any way. Obviously, there's things you can pick apart with any coach in terms of their in-game management and things that happen within a game. But overall, I think just one of my biggest takeaways from, maybe not just his first season, but his second season is just how he's kind of brought that steadying presence in person who is kind of seeming to build a culture that feels a little bit more sustainable than anything that we've seen really in the last 20 plus years of Indiana basketball.
Yeah, no, those are good points. And I think that his personality, he's just super comfortable in who he is. And I think that kind of resonates throughout the players as well. Like, he talked a pretty big game about sort of restoring this program back to Big Ten titles and to national championships. And I think that he believes that he's not scared of this job. He's not scared of the expectations. He's very comfortable with all facets of what this job entails in a way that I think Tom Crean and Archie Miller weren't at times. He's not looking over his shoulder at anybody. He's not like super worried about what the media is potentially saying. And I think there's just like a calm kind of confidence to him. He's a guy, his first press conference, he's talking about himself in the third person and was like, well, I wanted people to come talk to me about this job. Like, I had Dolson come fly out to me, and right. So there is sort of I wouldn't call it arrogance, but sort of like, hey, I definitely can do this job and I can do it well. And I want someone to recognize that and come talk to me about it. Right. I'm not going to be like begging for this job, so to speak. So yeah, I just think he's very, very comfortable in who he is. And, this is a guy that is coached for a long time, played for a long time, has seen a lot. I mean, this guy's the head coach of the Knicks, and I feel like, sort of almost, I guess it was still during the social media era in some sense, but I feel like, the New York media, right? Like this guy had to face like the New York Post, like trashing him, right? You can go back and see some of the articles kind of the end of his tenure there. Like there were some things written about him, and like he's taken on the brunt of criticism, etc. So I just feel like where some of the other past coaches have risen up from smaller schools and are like, wow, I have the Indiana job. I feel like in some ways for him, I don't know if I'd say it's like the inverse where he's like moving down to Indiana. I just feel like it's not something that is like a daunting or scary task. And he's very familiar with Bloomington. He's very familiar with the culture. And so it is kind of a nice marriage between understanding everything, but also not being afraid of it.
Yeah. And I think kind of expanding on what you just said in terms of him being comfortable, I think that allows him to be himself in situations, particularly us in the media asking him questions on press conferences, whether it's Zoom or in person. We saw after that game in this season at Iowa, where he obviously wasn't happy with some things that went on. Like he gives an honest answer, an honest assessment about what he thinks about things. And I think a reason for that is, like you said, he's been kind of in these situations where there's a lot of scrutiny on him. And, you're Indiana basketball, arguably one of the biggest seats in all of college basketball. People have called it a fishbowl, and there's constant scrutiny. It's what allows us to do our job, at Inside the Hall, the interest in the program. But if you've been the head coach of the Knicks and you've coached some of the players that he has and been in the situations that he has throughout his career, this probably just feels like a natural thing for him. Obviously, it helps that he played for Indiana. But overall, I think as much as people may be a little bit disappointed ultimately at how Indiana's season ended and not getting further than a round of 32, I don't think there's really any way you can look at the first two seasons of the Woodson era as anything other than progress. I wanted to kind of switch gears here a little bit and talk about Trayce Jackson-Davis and Jalen Hood-Schifino, not in the sense of what they have just accomplished these past seasons, but maybe looking forward now to their futures. But we're sitting here now on the morning of April 19th. The NBA draft combine is next month in Chicago. I think it's a foregone conclusion that both players will obviously participate in that event. Trayce Jackson-Davis was going to participate last year, but unfortunately tested positive for COVID, and that kind of set in motion the him coming back for last season. And obviously he goes on to have a really great season, arguably the best season of anybody in college basketball last year. And Jalen Hood-Schifino wins Big Ten Freshman of the Year. And I think a lot of people at the beginning of the season wondered, is he going to be a one and done? Is he going to have that type of season that allows him to leave after 1 year? And down the stretch of this past year, he really proved himself to be a guy that, in the eyes of the NBA, is probably a lock to be picked somewhere in the top 20, 25. And there's projections that have him higher going into the lottery. You've obviously followed the NBA for a long time, probably more closely than I have. I'm just curious your thoughts on how those guys translate to the NBA. And, if you're a fan of an NBA team or somebody that, that follows the league closely, do you see both of those players maybe as long-term pros and maybe how they fit in?
In terms of Hood-Schifino, I think, the tape that you sense at NBA teams is really what he did at Mackey. Whatever, he had there 33 points, but it's specifically what he did against Edey's drop coverage. And I think when you project him to the NBA with a, large part often being very pick and roll heavy, that there are teams and there are certain matchups where the 5 is going to drop. And I think he really showed during his freshman season that he could attack that well because of his mid-range game. So he's definitely going to be playing against, I think, better guard defense than he faced in Mackey from Purdue's backcourt. So I see him as someone that can grow into, a point guard or a lead guard that in certain matchups and in certain coverages, his strengths really do translate to the next level. I think he needs to continue to get better at shooting the 3 for sure. I think his size also is super helpful. He's a little bit longer, a little bit bigger for that position. Well, I mean, not a little bit bigger, but he's got length, and he can certainly, I don't know if I would have called him a lockdown defender this year, but he has the tool set to be an adequate NBA defender. And one thing with him, he did it like a little bit, but he didn't really get all the way to the rim a ton. So I think that's like another area where he can get better around the basket too, and be a little bit more 3-level between the 3-point shooting, the mid range, and the basket. That'll be helpful for him. Definitely had some good, I think, pretty good court vision and a good passer. So I think he's got some, elite mid-range stuff, which is having him pop a bit. I think his size and that's helping as well in terms of where he is being projected now and being so young. And, again, NBA kind of drafting more potential. In terms of Trayce, where does he fit? It's tough because he kind of, it's part of the reason I feel like he was not on draft boards really at all in previous seasons, is that, he doesn't really step out and shoot. He's not 7 feet tall. He's kind of like a tweener in terms of like where he actually kind of fits and where he would play. And I think that's kind of been what's held him back in terms of the eyes of the NBA. But I would go back to, I don't know, it was maybe in like January or February, maybe early February or late January, somewhere maybe around there, that the J. Kyle Mann and Kevin O'Connor podcast on the Ringer. Forget the name of their pod. A lot of NBA Ringer pods over there. I think it's kind of like a NBA draft breakdown they do. But I think they made a lot of good points about, again, sort of what I'm saying, that he doesn't maybe have a fit that immediately stands out well in a way that Hood-Schifino does. But where they kind of talked about him was kind of more in a dribble handoff role, and that he has the ability to do more things out of there than maybe some other players in the NBA that are just kind of dribble handing off to guards and stuff. I think he can take it himself, right? We've seen him been able to face up and kind of use his quickness. And so it's about kind of those type of areas where he might be able to excel in a way that some other players maybe don't have as many options out of something like that. And then I just think he has really shown an ability to block shots, to rebound. And even though he was pretty predictable in some ways about using his left all the time, he just was able to get bucket after bucket after bucket. So again, not the smoothest fit for him at the next level, but I think there are some areas and some ways that he can be used where if a team kind of can recognize that and bring that out and it works in their system, where he can have a solid fit.
Yeah, a couple of points just on both of those guys. When Jalen declared, I got some of the obvious responses on social media of, he's not ready, needs another year. I think one thing people don't maybe understand that don't follow the NBA as closely, you look at a guy like Romeo Langford, he came out after one season, but if you're a first round pick, you're basically guaranteed a couple of years contract, and then there's options, I believe, for the third and fourth years. Most players who are picked, in the top 10, 15 picks are going to get those 4 years. And the example of Romeo, he gets 4 years, and I think he's already made over $16 million. If Hood-Schifino is picked in a similar spot, he's basically guaranteeing himself kind of a floor of, 15, 20 million, depending on how the new CBA affects rookie salaries. If he's picked in the similar range of Romeo, he could obviously go higher and make more money. I think that's, selfishly, I understand fans wanting a guy to come back and see him grow as a player, but I think this benefits Hood-Schifino, obviously, because he's guaranteeing himself, setting his family up probably for the foreseeable future. Also benefits, I believe, Indiana in that if you show that you can bring a player in who's, I think he was ranked somewhere between, 25, 30 in the country in the final rankings, depending on where you looked at. You bring him in as a freshman, feature him the way that Indiana did, and turn him into, a fringe lottery pick, maybe a lottery pick after 1 year. I think that can help you in recruiting going forward. So I think it's kind of a win-win for Jalen and also for the program that he leaves. I think it makes sense that he goes. And on Trayce, the thing that kind of sticks out to me when I'm just kind of thinking about his NBA draft stock and where he might be picked, I go back a lot and look at old drafts and like see, which guys pan out, and obviously most of your superstar players, there's an exception of guys like Giannis and Jokic and others who have been, Jalen Brunson in recent years, who have been second round picks. But most of the players that you're going to get in the NBA draft who are surefire, starters in the league are going to be picked early in the draft. I think when you get down in the late first round and early second, and you can grab a player like Trayce, who you kind of know that he's produced at such a high level, and you're not drafting solely off potential, I think that can be very attractive for a team to take a guy that that the floor is pretty high. Even maybe he doesn't have the ceiling, but a lot of times you'll see teams reach on a freshman, a guy that's 18 or 19 years old, and the guy's out of the league within a year, never makes it, bounces around the G League. So I think for Trayce, maybe not the upside of some players that are going to be picked in that range, but I think at least, there's going to be a team that recognizes like, hey, this guy was the first or second best player last year in college basketball. we know his work ethic is pretty strong. We know his character is strong. We know he can do X, Y, and Z. Can he step out and shoot 3-pointers? No, but we know that, if we use him as an energy guy, maybe off the bench for 8 to 12 minutes, something like that to start, that we're probably going to get a baseline of production that's pretty strong. So I think there's value in that.
Yeah, and one thing I guess a couple things I didn't mention on him either is that going along with what you said here in terms of kind of knowing what you're getting and having a higher floor, I think this year he really proved like he's a really smart player too. I think his passing ability, raised up to another level. I think he sees the floor really well for his position, even though sometimes he was having to see the floor from 2 or 3 players on him. So that's like another feather in his cap, and his ability to get a rebound and go, right? And to start a break, I think again, these are kind of all these little kind of tiny skills that I think if used correctly, and again, right, in a bench role, and he knows what he's doing and is in the right, and a lot of this comes down to fit, right? Sometimes you don't have the right fit or you don't get the right opportunity with a team, and some of that stuff isn't exposed. So, it's possible that happens to him first and then he maybe catches on somewhere else. So I'm pretty interested to see like how many NBA games he ends up playing and what type of a player he turns into. I mean, and you just never know, like, what might happen there. But there's enough there where I think in the right situation, he's got a shot at carving out some decent minutes for somebody.
Looking forward to next season for IU basketball, obviously a lot still to be determined. There's some departures via the transfer portal. Tamar Bates obviously moving on to Missouri. Logan Duncombe transfers to Xavier. Jordan Geronimo still in the portal, has not picked a new school. And then obviously the players who have moved on, whether that be Hood-Schifino going early to the NBA, Trayce Jackson Davis as well, could have used an extra year, but is going to go out in the NBA. And then Miller Kopp and Race Thompson both have their eligibility exhausted. So a lot of turnover out of the returning guys for next season. Not talking about obviously Peyton Sparks and Khalil Ware who are coming in via the transfer portal. I'm just curious who you think maybe 1 or 2 guys who you're most intrigued to see what they can do with a full offseason in Bloomington, whether that be one of the freshmen from last year or an upperclassman. Who maybe are you most intrigued by this offseason? And who do you think maybe can step up next year and take on a larger role? Because obviously there's going to be a lot of production to fill for this program next year.
It's a good question. To me, a guy like, I don't know, like Galloway, I feel like can probably improve around the margins, but I'm not sure there's really like a kind of a big leap for him to take anymore. I would say, Renew is another one to me where I'm interested to see if he can add or maybe profile some other skills that he has. I think what happened with him was against lesser competition, you did see some more perimeter skills. There was a game earlier in the season where he kind of made got in his bag a bit, as the kids say, and had kind of a nice dribble move and kind of had like a step back near the free throw line. And I was like, whoa, I didn't know he could do that. But I think as the season went along, he struggled so much with fouls, and there wasn't really like space for him to be doing that at all in the offense and the way things are run. And I think they just kind of simplified things for him to try to get him time on the court, which could be a struggle at times with all that fouling, as I noted. So I'm interested to see if he can stay on the court and foul less, which is typical, of freshman bigs. They do often struggle with fouls, and if he can clean that up and kind of have a longer runway to play in games, how he may be used potentially more in the perimeter as well, while still being able to kind of be a mini TJD using his left hand to score down on the block. In terms of, Banks or Gunn, they're intriguing from the point of, I think when they did get in, their energy and effort were definitely there. I just think, can they actually rise to the level of enough trust with Woodson in what they're doing. Gunn was not shy to shoot, and I think that was almost welcome in some sense with how many threes this team did not take this year on offense. But sometimes he maybe took more than he should have. The percentage was not great. And Banks, he got some run here and there, and I think he brought some good energy. Always kind of seemed to be in the mix for offensive rebound or tip-ins, but can he expand his game beyond that, right? Can he, again, play longer minutes? Can he, show that he can get better at shooting? Can he play make at all? Those are all pretty big questions. But again, when you have freshmen that are not lottery picks and you really rode veterans this year, it's just the picture is unclear what some of these guys may or may not be able to do next season. And some of the players under Mike Woodson from year 1 to year 2, you could definitely see improvement, and with others that wasn't the case. So kind of who pops and how and when, it doesn't need to be in November. It could be in January or February. But there's definitely still there are some question marks sort of lingering around who may step out of those 3 freshmen, I think.
Yeah, I think the challenge right now for any program, obviously you're going to have your freshmen that come in who are a one and done player, but those are few and far between. And so there's a lot of development that needs to be done. And with kind of your other younger players who do choose to stick around, the problem is there's, with this transfer portal now being as open as it is and guys can just move, you may not see as many players stick around if they don't get much of a chance. So I think it's pretty important that Indiana is able to develop CJ Gunn and Caleb Banks and make them into contributors. The challenge with that is just the opportunity for them to play, because Mike Woodson obviously is in a win now mode. There's a lot of pressure to be good every year at Indiana. And obviously, he's not going to be in Bloomington for 15 or 20 years. So this limited run that he has, whatever it is, if it's 5 or 10 years, every year is important, and he wants to maximize the team on a year-to-year basis. So he's going to kind of be bringing in transfer portal players who, if you look at some of the guys that he's brought in, there's expectations that they play a lot. And, they're obviously still recruiting for next season and wing help and players that are kind of going to be in direct competition with CJ Gunn and Caleb Banks for minutes are obviously needs for this team next season. So I think it's a balancing act that's going to have to be done. But I do think it's important that Indiana does continue to develop young players in the program and not just bring in help from the transfer portal. So to me, Banks is a pretty big piece moving forward potentially, because I saw a lot of good things that he was able to do when he did get an opportunity. I think really the thing that he needs is just an opportunity and reps, and that's kind of the same thing that we saw with Jordan Geronimo, where he stayed for 3 years, but his role just kind of fluctuated and changed so much that he never really got comfortable and never really got a chance to kind of play through mistakes. And I think maybe next year with a team that doesn't really have the same expectations of this year's team, maybe next year the goal is just to get into the tournament or be a top half of the Big Ten team. I think maybe that gives Mike Woodson a little bit more opportunity to play some of the younger guys and give them a chance to develop, so that maybe the next season that they're able to step up into bigger roles. But I think really one of the things that I look back on last season that was kind of a disappointment, if you had to make a list, was just the utilization of the bench, and maybe some of the bench not developing, because all we heard about in the preseason was, this team has 2 starting lineups. And then by the end of the season, it was really just 6 or 7 guys playing all the minutes. So it's a difficult thing to do, I think, as a coaching staff when you're trying to bring in portal guys and develop your young players. But I think it's definitely important for guys like CJ Gunn and Caleb Banks to not be lost in the mix long term.
Yeah, I agreed there. It's certainly a balancing act, and to kind of get the recipe right now in this new era with the portal, it's tricky, right? I think you just try to max out as best you can every year that your roster, and the advantage of the portal now is if you were just to look at Indiana's roster coming back after this season with all the veterans that are leaving, with Hood-Schifino moving on to the NBA. The cupboard would be a bit more bare, and you would really be relying on Banks and CJ Gunn and, possibly Renew as well, like developing. And that could be what could sort of tips the scales on the season, where the transfer portal now allows you to sort of augment that and say, I can go out and get a proven player that is older, that's a veteran, that knows what they're doing. And he may not be an NBA lottery pick, but I can trust what he brings defensively. I can trust what he can do in our system. And sometimes you can't trust or fully rely on some of the younger players as they continue to develop. So that's kind of where they're at right now, right? It's a, with every name gets put out there. I think right now, as you look at it, with the front court, Duncombe has moved on and will be at Xavier next year, and TJD is looking to be a draft pick here soon for the NBA. And Peyton Sparks comes in as a backup for the front court, and then they go out and get Ware. And so that's kind of been, in terms of just minutes that need to be attributed in a kind of a standard front court, like they've filled those roles with bodies, more or less, right? Which they did not have if you just kind of look at their raw roster when kind of the season ended. But there's still some, again, these players were on IU kind of some more wings, right, or guards that you're kind of wondering if they're going to take that leap sophomore year. Having other names in the portal that Indiana's kind of currently in the mix for is a little bit of a safety valve, or like a guard against having to fully rely on that. And, there's a couple more scholarships open, and we'll kind of see what happens there. And then I think that allows, maybe takes, I don't know, I'd say that there pressure on the Banks or Gunn, but it has you rely less on them popping and taking their game to the next level than like you would have this side of, 5-10 years ago in a program where that's it. You have you can't go get an impact guy at a kind of a snap of a finger like you can these days.
Yeah, last thing before we wrap up, I just wanted to ask, in your opinion, what are the biggest remaining needs for Indiana as you look ahead to next year? We'll assume that Xavier Johnson is indeed coming back, because I think if there was going to be a problem with the waiver, first of all, I don't necessarily think they would have talked about it publicly when they said he was shutting things down for the season and was going to request the waiver. I don't think you say that unless you think there's a pretty good chance that he's going to get it. And second, I think you would have heard a lot more names in terms of point guards being recruited from the transfer portal if there was a chance that he wasn't going to be back. So I'm not saying that it's a done deal by any stretch of the imagination. It just kind of seems like logically that we would have heard something in terms of him not being back. So let's assume that he is back. What do you kind of see as maybe the biggest need for next season in terms of remaining roster spots? And what, it's really, I guess, hard to answer this as we sit here on April 19th, but it's a question that I think we'll get a lot in the community as the offseason goes along. What are realistic expectations, I guess, for Indiana next season? In my mind, it's kind of, they just kind of need to figure out a way to get in the tournament and build, continue to build this consistency as a program. And we'll see what happens with future recruiting classes and future transfer portal efforts. But I think obviously the pieces are going to be there to make the tournament, but still a lot to be determined just in terms of who's actually going to be on the court and filling the minutes.
In terms of what they still need, I mean, when you look at who's still kind of on the board that they're targeting, right? It's sort of that wing scorer or more perimeter oriented players that can create their own shot or get to the bucket or can shoot, right? I think you look at the roster now, that's a little lacking in sort of what you see in the tournament of just some more dynamic wing players that have kind of taken teams a little bit farther than Indiana got this season. So you look at like a Ledlam, who, to me, the thing that like pops off the screen from his just watching tape on him is just he can really just get to the basket. Might not be the most athletic or pretty or highlight reel type moves that he makes, but just kind of like a strength there, and he just gets there. And that has been something that I just feel like this team has not really had much of, even dating back before Mike Woodson's tenure. So I think that's kind of a skill, a guy that can just get to the basket. That would be helpful just to have and to draw fouls and things like that. And then obviously, some of these other guys like that, I think you pronounce it Connect from Northern Colorado. Like, we'll see where that sort of how that maybe transfers to a higher major program, but certainly can score in a variety of ways, kind of a dynamic player. So it's kind of within that realm. I think, and even looking at like a Cormac Ryan, somebody that got a quick release and can really fill it up and can bring some more shooting, are all kind of things that it looks like they're targeting, and that I think that the staff knows, and I think from the outside looking in, that's something that the program still needs. In terms of expectations for next year, I mean, the picture is so unclear. It's kind of hard to say, okay, roster set, and here's kind of where they can go from that. But just kind of, I guess, in the macro, not thinking about the roster, I think certainly trying to get into the tournament again, or just being in the mix for the tournament, or being in the tournament really, I guess is sort of like the floor now for this program. I feel like, Woodson was able to kind of pull a rabbit out of the hat at the end of his first season to get them in. And then this year, there was never really a question. I think for this team last year, the question was, well, I think as we saw, I don't know if it was the question, so to speak, but like they just didn't have like enough dudes, and I think they didn't have enough dynamic playing at like multiple positions to be able to play with the elite teams. We think of like Arizona game, the Kansas game, and even into the tournament against Miami. They did get a lead against Miami in the second half, but there was like an athleticism and kind of an all hands on deck from all positions that kind of overwhelmed the squad. And you look at the end of the season here on KenPom, they finished 30th, and they made the round of 32, right? And I think this team was like on the outside looking into the true elite of the college basketball landscape. They were just kind of on the outer skirts of really, really being a very good, they were kind of just a little bit, they're a very good team that was not a great team, is kind of how I describe them. And they were a little bit too one-dimensional in some of the things that they did. So year 3, yeah, I think tournament's the floor. And I could even see, depending on who they get and depending on matchups, if they do make the tournament, who knows? They could go farther than they did this year. And I think there's a version of the way things play out where some guys don't land in the portal and they're relying more on freshmen, where making the tournament could be a little dicey heading down the stretch in February. So it's really kind of yet to be seen exactly what they'll be able to pull off next year. But I feel like almost all scenarios are almost in play at this point.
Agreed, 110% on all those points. Ryan, good to have you back. It's always good to chat a little IU basketball, even if we're totally uncertain still a little bit on who's going to be on the team next year. It's this portal era is obviously good for the site and interest in college basketball as we head into a time that usually was a little bit more of a dead period. I think it's been good overall, just in terms of interest in the sport, but it does lead to, I think, a little bit of angst with the fan base. Just a lot of people wondering like who's going to visit next or who's going to commit next. And these are obviously very fluid situations. The portal is something to get used to. I think this is the first year that Indiana fans have kind of really experienced it. Last year was it was in full swing, but if you remember back to last spring, Indiana was really had a big freshman class coming in, and there wasn't really an opportunity to add anybody from the portal. This year is different, obviously, with all the departures and obviously space to fill. So a little bit of an adjustment period. I've tried to tell people who seem to be a little bit concerned about the roster next year, just be patient. There's obviously 1,200-1,300 players in the portal. Indiana's going to fill the spots. Just take a little bit longer than some would like. As for Podcast on the Brink, not sure exactly the cadence in terms of how often we'll have episodes here in the off season. Been going every other week here. Obviously, as news breaks and things like that, we may pop in a little bit more regularly. But it's always something we really enjoy, just doing the podcast and having a chance to talk IU hoops. So we'll be back soon with another episode of Podcast on the Brink. If you enjoy the show, please leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts. Leave us a rating on Spotify, and we'll talk to everybody again soon. Have a good rest of your week and a good weekend.